Chapter 1. Film Censorship in Zimbabwe. Introduction. Background study. Zimbabwe was colonized by Britain through the British South African Company. BSAC, led by Cecil John Rhodes in 1890. African resistance to colonization in 1893 and 1896-7 culminated not only in the military defeat of the natives, but with the hanging of iconic leaders such as Nyanda. But, for the new white settlers to have only militarily defeated Africans, was not considered a sufficient deterrent against the possibility in future of another African-inspired armed resistance. In order to consolidate their hegemony over Africans, the white settlers did not only establish a colonial government in Rhodesia, but proceeded to mount a systematic assault on African culture. The colonial government enacted a plethora of media laws to suppress the resistance of black people. In the field of film, the hastily introduced Obscene Publications Ordinance Act of 1911 and Cinematograph Ordinance Act of 1912 had negative effects on the rights of black people to express their ideas and opinions about the oppression and marginalization that they were experiencing in Rhodesia. The Obscene Publications Ordinance Act prohibited blacks to publish what was perceived by the colonial authorities as subversive information, while the Cinematograph Ordinance Act of 1912 blocked black people from participating in telling their stories of white oppression through visual images. Patel, 1997. To force on Africans political conformity necessary to the running of the new political economy, the white settlers' Department of Native Affairs promoted written publications and films that painted a positive picture of the colonial government while presenting Africans as a people without history. White writers authorized images of Africans as savages in need of perpetual moral and spiritual guidance from European settlers. In the early days of the colony, Africans were not to be exposed to writing or viewing film. In fact, the colonial government encouraged Africans to continue preserving some obscurantist cultural practices not considered subversive to white domination. In other words, colonial power valorized traditional African cultures and some moribund aspects of African cultures that performed the service of disguising and legitimating colonial power. Moore, 2004. Zimbabwe was colonized by Britain through the British South African Company. BSAC, led by Cecil John Rhodes in 1890. African resistance to colonization in 1893 and 1896-7 culminated not only in the military defeat of the natives, but with the hanging of iconic leaders such as Nyanda. But, for the new white settlers to have only militarily defeated Africans, was not considered a sufficient deterrent against the possibility in future of another African-inspired armed resistance. In order to consolidate their hegemony over Africans, the white settlers did not only establish a colonial government in Rhodesia, but proceeded to mount a systematic assault on African culture. The colonial government enacted a plethora of media laws to suppress the resistance of black people. In the field of film, the hastily introduced Obscene Publications Ordinance Act of 1911 and Cinematograph Ordinance Act of 1912 had negative effects on the rights of black people to express their ideas and opinions about the oppression and marginalization that they were experiencing in Rhodesia. The Obscene Publications Ordinance Act prohibited blacks to publish what was perceived by the colonial authorities as subversive information, while the Cinematograph Ordinance Act of 1912 blocked black people from participating in telling their stories of white oppression through visual images. Patel, 1997. To force on Africans political conformity necessary to the running of the new political economy, the white settlers' Department of Native Affairs promoted written publications and Films that painted a positive picture of the colonial government while presenting Africans as a people without history. White writers authorized images of Africans as savages in need of perpetual moral and spiritual guidance from European settlers. In the early days of the colony, Africans were not to be exposed to writing or viewing film. In fact, the colonial government encouraged Africans to continue preserving some obscurantist cultural practices not considered subversive to white domination. In other words, colonial power valorized traditional African cultures and some moribund aspects of African cultures that performed the service of disguising and legitimating colonial power. Moore, 2004. Zimbabwe was colonized by Britain through the British South African Company. BSAC, led by Cecil John Rhodes in 1890. African resistance to colonization in 1893 and 1896-7 culminated not only in the military defeat of the natives, but with the hanging of iconic leaders such as Nyanda. But, for the new white settlers to have only militarily defeated Africans, was not considered a sufficient deterrent against the possibility in future of another African-inspired armed resistance. In order to consolidate their hegemony over Africans, the white settlers did not only establish a colonial government in Rhodesia, but proceeded to mount a systematic assault on African culture. The colonial government enacted a plethora of media laws to suppress the resistance of black people. In the field of film, the hastily introduced Obscene Publications Ordinance Act of 1911 and Cinematograph Ordinance Act of 1912 had negative effects on the rights of black people to express their ideas and opinions about the oppression and marginalization that they were experiencing in Rhodesia. The Obscene Publications Ordinance Act prohibited blacks to publish what was perceived by the colonial authorities as subversive information, while the Cinematograph Ordinance Act of 1912 blocked black people from participating in telling their stories of white oppression through visual images. Patel, 1997. To force on Africans political conformity necessary to the running of the new political economy, the white settlers' Department of Native Affairs promoted written publications and films that painted a positive picture of the colonial government while presenting Africans as a people without history. White writers authorized images of Africans as savages in need of perpetual moral and spiritual guidance from European settlers. In the early days of the colony, Africans were not to be exposed to writing or viewing film. In fact, the colonial government encouraged Africans to continue preserving some obscurantist cultural practices not considered subversive to white domination. In other words, colonial power valorized traditional African cultures and some moribund aspects of African cultures that performed the service of disguising and legitimating colonial power. Moore, 2004. Zimbabwe was colonized by Britain through the British South African Company. BSAC, led by Cecil John Rhodes in 1890. African resistance to colonization in 1893 and 1896-7 culminated not only in the military defeat of the natives, but with the hanging of iconic leaders such as Nyanda. But, for the new white settlers to have only militarily defeated Africans, was not considered a sufficient deterrent against the possibility in future of another African-inspired armed resistance. In order to consolidate their hegemony over Africans, the white settlers did not only establish a colonial government in Rhodesia, but proceeded to mount a systematic assault on African culture. The colonial government enacted a plethora of media laws to suppress the resistance of black people. In the field of film, the hastily introduced Obscene Publications Ordinance Act of 1911 and Cinematograph Ordinance Act of 1912 had Negative effects on the rights of black people to express their ideas and opinions about the oppression and marginalization that they were experiencing in Rhodesia. The Obscene Publications Ordinance Act prohibited blacks to publish what was perceived by the colonial authorities as subversive information, while the Cinematograph Ordinance Act of 1912 blocked black people from participating in telling their stories of white oppression through visual images. Patel, 1997. To force on Africans political conformity necessary to the running of the new political economy. The white settlers' Department of Native Affairs promoted written publications and films that painted a positive picture of the colonial government while presenting Africans as a people without history. White writers authorized images of Africans as savages in need of perpetual moral and spiritual guidance from European settlers. In the early days of the colony, Africans were not to be exposed to writing or viewing film. In fact, the colonial government encouraged Africans to continue preserving some obscurantist cultural practices not considered subversive to white domination. In other words, colonial power valorized traditional African cultures and some moribund aspects of African cultures that performed the service of disguising and legitimating colonial power. Moore, 2004. Of course, the colonially derived forms of censorship that persist in post-independent Zimbabwe in all their visible and not-so-visible forms have not totally crippled the creative psyche of all the African filmmakers in post-independent Zimbabwe. Hungwe, 2005, 14, asserts that there is strong evidence that the colonial filmmakers underrated their audience, who developed rapidly with successive shows of films, and began to raise questions about the messages to which they were exposed, and how those messages related to their economic and political aspirations. It is undeniable that Zimbabwean filmmakers possess cultural capital. Van de Werfhorst, 2010:157, linked to, derived or resourced from their own African, traditional values, sifted from colonial socialization and also produced as a result of creative experimentation with the film camera. This nationalist narrative of the instrumentality of film in forging a communitarian identity emphasizes an African collective imaginaire of culture and politics, privileges, a manipulation of the rhetoric of autonomy, resistance, and emancipation, that gives legitimacy to an authentic African film discourse. Mbembe, Op. Cit. 240-1. As Moore observes about the resilience of cultural capital in the face of onslaught by invasive outside forces, the cultural field enjoys relative autonomy by virtue of two features. First, it is institutionally distantiated from the economic and political fields. It occupies its own social space, with its institutions, personnel, traditions, values, issues and forms of struggle. It has a specificity of its own. Second, its agents are not ostensibly members of the dominant class or working on its behalf. 2002, 449. This insight about the indestructibility of African culture, Cabral, 1970, applies to colonial Zimbabwe, especially with the oral genres of songs, most of them patronized by ordinary Africans, which ensured that these genres remained outside the creative economy patronized by colonial agents. However, in the 1930s it was hardly possible to imagine Africans wielding a film camera as a tool for ideological struggle. Colonial legislation such as the Entertainment Control and Censorship Act of 1932 widened the scope of control over African creativity to cover theatrical performances and public advertisements. Also, control of theatrical performance was particularly damaging to black nationalists, who, deprived from having access to mainstream media, had taken theater and drama as important avenues to communicate political messages to the majority of fellow black people. In 1954, the colonial government had formed the Literature Bureau, and while its main target was censorship of political messages in African literature in indigenous languages, the Bureau complemented other repressive laws in undermining the development of critical minds amongst Africans. With blacks increasingly demanding freedom from colonialism in the 1960s, the Rhodesian government responded harshly by enacting the Maintenance of Law and Order Act of 1965. Mazango and Chiumbu, 2000, contend that the motive behind the act was to prevent flow of information that was likely to undermine the Smith regime, and to legitimize violence as a means of controlling black political activism. As political protests among blacks became vicious, various instruments of censorship provided under the ambit of Entertainment's Control Act in 1967 were used extensively to regulate, control, restrict or prohibit the production of visual images, printing or publishing of information that promoted the liberation cause of the black people. The victory of black nationalists in 1980 against the Smith regime was not only on the military front. The new black government went on to repeal some of the draconian laws in the political, economic, and cultural spheres that had been inherited from the white racist government. However, in the process, the new leadership retained some of the censorship laws which were reformulated and introduced under the Censorship and Entertainment's Control Act of 1967. In the 1990s, the black and nationalist government in power in Zimbabwe introduced its own new laws such as the Public Order and Security Act, POSA, and Access to Information Protection of Privacy Act, APA. These laws have been used in complementary ways to curtail freedom of expression in film and other forms of media, and their influences on the development of Zimbabwe's national culture, have been contradictory. Films in the Shona and English languages have been affected, and this book seeks to determine the extent to which the films have been influenced by these laws, and how, in turn, filmmakers responded to these laws through their artistic works. The necessity to reveal this dialectical relationship between artistic freedom and the struggle against authoritarian legislation had been skewed in critical studies that ascribed colonialism with extraordinary powers to control all the facets of African culture. Veit Wild, 1993. Chiwome, 1996, expressed through film and other forms of art. On the other hand, the capacity of film and other forms of art to resist censorship has also been exaggerated in ways that underestimate the possibilities of ideological infiltration of film messages by dominant values. This theoretical hiatus or gap produced by celebrating film's resistive capabilities and failure to detect ideological and structural fault lines in the colonial narrative simplify complex configurations in the resistance narrative and the colonial and post-colonial narrative. The idea that these categories are stable will be interrogated using, among other theories, the decolonial episteme, which according to Grossfogel, moves analysis of film beyond political economy paradigms that pay scant attention to how the use of metaphorical language in film does not simply confirm the presence of layers of censorship of ideas, but that metaphorical language in film produces knowledge from below, Obscene 213, that encourages irreverence of, and reveal contradictions within both dominant and subaltern narratives. Therefore, theoretical aporias or gaps exist in the works that have examined the relationship between Zimbabwean film and the limits of censorship. This is because these works have not made use of approaches that emphasize the importance of the heterogeneity of film's languages or semiotic systems. which can carnivalize, undermine and expose how official efforts to censor film messages is not total but also invites subversive elements of the verbal and visual signifiers of film to generate meanings opposed to official power and even reveal meanings unintended by the filmmaker. Area of study. Since 1980, studies have been carried out by scholars on Zimbabwean films to show the potential of film to represent social and political realities. Drag, 1993, points out that earlier film productions such as Corridors of Freedom, 1987, After the Hunger and Drought, 1988, Consequences, 1988, and The Sanctions Debate, 1990, mainly focused on the representation of liberation struggle, identity crisis, social issues such as teenage pregnancy and economic problems. An article by Mabwi Azara, 2010, entitled The Post-Independence Development of Film in Zimbabwe, traces the development of film industry and the challenges the industry continues to face. The article concentrates on the technical challenges of film production without providing much information on how socio-political forces such as censorship impede on the development of the film industry in Zimbabwe. Focusing on film representations and trends on film development is a success in itself, but what is problematic is that it appears that there is a conscious or unconscious neglect of an equally important area which concerns film censorship. An attempt to establish a comprehensive study on how film is subjected to state restrictions is provided by Hungwe, 1991. In the article Southern Rhodesia Propaganda and Education Films for Peasant Farmers, 1948 to 1955, Hungwe, 1991, provides an analysis into ways in which colonial Rhodesia used film to suppress information. This was done by excluding pertinent themes of the Liberation War in favor of less savory themes that looked down upon Africans, especially the peasant farmer. Bryce, 2005, and Zemedia, 2010, provide informed discussions on how the War Veteran Association sought to suppress the voice of female ex-combatants by threatening to ban the film Flame, 1996, that depicts a male guerrilla raping his female compatriot. This brief review reveals a limited tendency in Zimbabwe film criticism that analyze films with open political themes. The view projected in these analyses is that colonialism, the liberation struggle and the post-independent narrative of betrayal are the Zimbabwean master narratives that encode censorship. Other social and cultural narratives that do not reveal censorship in more obvious ways have thus tended to be ignored. How to discern political censorship in film narratives with an emphasis on culture is rendered difficult. And equally, how to identify culture-based censorship in film with obtrusive political themes are occluded. As a result, how to pinpoint ways through which films contest censorship is also left unclarified. This study argues that censorship manifests most as politically damaging to creativity in film through a range of manifestations such as in banning, persecution of filmmakers, reproduction of social stereotypes and enforcement of undemocratic laws that undermine freedom of expression. It will be demonstrated that filmmakers have also developed a wide range of rhetorical devices of film languages to counter the possibilities of co-optation of film meanings that seek to expand the democratic space of the freedom of imagination and creative dissidence. El Sadawi, 2007. My conviction is that more studies should be done in the area of film censorship such that audiences are informed about the forces that conspire against the development of film industry in Zimbabwe. Despite having fought a liberation war that was meant to create conditions conducive to freedom of expression, post-colonial Zimbabwe government reproduced colonial censorship laws and, in some cases, introduced new draconian laws that cripple free flow of information. Whenever Zimbabwean critics debate how these laws suppress freedom of expression, the discussions focus on their impact on newspapers, radio, and television. This situation has created conditions in which the specificity of how films are affected by censorship laws has not sufficiently been interrogated. Furthermore, the little research that has been done on the impact of censorship laws on films gives the incorrect impression that censorship laws have had a totally overwhelming control on film language. Studies that attempt to move away from this position that ascribe extraordinary powers to the laws in regulating film meanings have inadvertently embraced a theoretical simplification in which it is argued that filmmakers and their films possess, at all times, the creative power to undermine and subvert the censorship laws. These two ideological positions underestimate the fact that censorship laws can be challenged, and that the contestation of these laws in film is contradictory insofar as some films reveal evidence of having been infiltrated by dominant values. To compound the problem identified in this study, previous critical works on censorship of film have tended to explore those films that are openly political in order to provide evidence of state control. Films that deal with cultural issues have consequently not been highlighted as cultural spaces where censorship laws are either entrenched as well as being resisted in films that experiment with new techniques. Censorship practices that range from banning of films, intimidating filmmakers, and self-censorship encouraged by legal statutes have not been critically interrogated in their complexities. Therefore, the silencing of film messages through official film censorship has had negative repercussions. These silences have unfortunately tended to ignore possibilities that the film genre can challenge the restrictions imposed on it by the state censorship laws and self-censorship practices entrenched in the minds of individual filmmakers. Justification of study. There are more important reasons that justify carrying out this study. First, most research in Zimbabwe done on censorship has tended to focus on the mainstream media such as radio, newspapers, and television. There is no substantive work written in Zimbabwe regarding the interplay between censorship on film language by the state and the open and subtle ways in which filmmakers practice self-censorship. This scholarly gap has tended to marginalize attempts at understanding how film functions in restrictive situations where the notion of a third cinema emphasizes films' liberatory ethics. Second, previous studies have tended to overemphasize the role of state censorship of art carried out by institutions such as the Rhodesia Literature Bureau. This has created a false picture in which the power of the state to dominate and limit what art can depict is presented as overwhelming. Consequently, Zimbabwean art or film's capacity to authorize counter-narratives through symbolical language of images and metaphors has been underestimated. The exclusive critiques on state censorship resulted in hiding the fact that artists or filmmakers also practice self-censorship that undermines the reproduction of the liberational potential of their art. This study reveals that state-induced censorship is sometimes complemented by censoring discourses inherent in patriarchal systems wittingly and unwittingly used by the same ordinary people who want to free themselves from various forms of censorship. There is no comprehensive study in Zimbabwe that has made a direct link between the shrinking of democratic space offered by film as popular culture to the introduction of state laws such as POSA and AIPPA. What is present are fragmented reviews, most of them focusing on single films. My study differs because it explores the effects of different forms of censorship on political films, cultural films, film genres, and the economic film This will allow the reader to experience how censorship manifests in differently themed films as well as how in the same films, the embedded rhetorical devices help to contest the hegemonies of censoring discourses. Third, previous studies have relied on the dominant thesis paradigm promoted in sociological theories to explain the censorship of films in Zimbabwe. This paradigm accords undue or extraordinary power on the state to stifle creativity in film narratives. My study recognizes the importance of sociological theories, but introduces language-based theories to the analysis of film to detect where censorship is most felt, and how film language works to undermine infiltration by dominant values. The explanatory energy of language-based theories derives from the recognition of the instability in the images and metaphors used in film language. These fractures encourage interpreting the meanings of films in more than one way. Language-based theories are dialogic, Bakhtin, 1981. They reveal how in telling a story, film reflects on itself in the act of telling, pointing towards endlessly displaced, deferred and different meanings and supplements to meanings that produce a palimpsest in which earlier or alternative meanings are never completely obliterated. Brink, 2007. 335. This deconstructive principle emphasized in language theories is dynamic and disclosive. Lazarus, 2007, 341. Film does not only concern itself with representing experience through language but with experiencing language through a destruction of representation. Brink, Obscene 333. Destruction of representation in film is achieved by or through a subversive interpretation of film against the totalizing rationalist progressivism. Lazarus, Obscene 342, embedded in state censorship laws. Lastly, appreciating language as a quest, even in those films that appear hopelessly censored, manifests the fantastic dimension of language that, according to Jackson, traces the unsaid and the unseen of culture, that which has been silenced, made invisible, covered over and made absent. 1981, 4. My study, therefore, takes the films discussed in here as evidence of third cinema whose revolutionary imperative is to oppose the closed, monological forms of the language of censorship laws with dialogical structures that scrutinize the categories of the truths and moralities contained in discourses of official narratives. But, in order to understand how film narratives can be inhabited by censoring values and also to comprehend how film language can fend off the possibilities of being appropriated to serve dominant interests, I need to briefly discuss the concept of language. Understanding the concept of language. Language refers, first and foremost, to what Brink describes as a system, as a phenomenon, as a practice, as a process, whose material, Brink, Obscene 336. Existence is manifested as Shona or English. According to Wa Thiongo, language has a dual character, that is, it is both a means of communication and a carrier of culture. Wa Thiongo, 1986. Language communicates ideas, norms, values, attitudes, prejudices and perspectives. For Wa Thiongo, 1996, the language of real life is the matrix of the social relations of power and powerless that reveals values contesting for ideological supremacy in society. Censors are interested in controlling the meanings of the struggles in the language of real life. The social struggles that manifest the language of real life are rendered in the form of written and unwritten modes that use words, visuals, color, sound and light. Kudry, 2003, writes that the symbolic power of language impacts negatively or positively on society in what people do and also how they describe their social, political and economic spaces. Representations of struggles to censor films or to deny censorship in films happen inside and not outside language. Language frames thought, and as such, language carries the power to control, restrict, prevent, persuade, and even block others from expressing alternative thoughts. The referential theory of language identifies the meaning of language expressions with that which language metaphorically or connotatively refers to. Alston, 2000. The metaphoric aspect creates different tributaries of expression where the user of language has the leeway to use words and symbols with hidden meanings that may not be easily monitored or policed by dominant powers. Because of the symbolical instabilities inherent in language, it leaks and in the process creates potential gaps, aporias, and ruptures. Bogdan, 1981, that the people whose artistic works are threatened with control or censorship can manipulate to free themselves. Fanon underscores further the dialectical nature of language when he writes that to speak a language is to take on a world, a culture. To be in a position to grasp the morphology of this or that language. But above all, to assume a culture, is to support the weight of civilization. A man who has a language possesses the world expressed and implied in that language. Mastery of language affords remarkable power. Fanon. Quoted in Shivora, 2012, 14. The moment Fanon, Ibid, speaks about language and power, he brings to attention how language can be manipulated to coerce, persuade, or convince its recipients to agree with concerns expressed through speech acts or through visual imagery. Similarly, through filmic language, audiences can be lured towards predetermined goals set by filmmakers and those who control the material and political conditions of film production and its distribution. Lenin once asserted that, by virtue of its social function, language is not and cannot be an independent realm. It is indissolubly linked with thought, social consciousness, and objective reality, the needs of which language serves. Thought does not exist on its own, it is embodied in language. Language is the direct reality of thought, Lenin quoted in Shivora, 2012, 14. The power in and of language to be used to name, describe, explain, and resist values imposed from above links language to the concept of ideology. The censorship laws are contested spaces where struggles to dominate and liberate are waged. To fully understand how censorship laws are a force field marked by resistance, incorporation, infiltration, and acquiescence, it is imperative to define film censorship. Film censorship defined. The concept of film censorship has been used to refer to related, but quite different practices such as governmental prior restraint on expression, criminal prosecution, and punishment for obscenity, and administrative regulation of expressive content by film producers. Peleg, 1993, 4, defines film censorship as the systematic control of content by a government through various means. Some important aspects of this definition are that film censorship involves control of content and that the control is normally instituted by the government. However, Peleg's 1993 definition does not explain control of content by those involved at the administrative levels of film production, as well as control that can be explained by an actor's failure to master suitable language of expressing his/her ideas. An informed definition is provided by Dick, 2008, who redefines film censorship not just a repressive tool with predictable results, but that film censorship is an unstable process of actions and reactions in the struggle for power which show the degree of powerlessness of those restricting information. This conceptualization of film censorship is significant because of its ability to define censorship as an unstable process and that it reflects the degree of powerlessness on the part of the censor. The instability of censorship is brought about by the subjective nature of film art, refuting as it does predetermined interpretations of social reality. Also, the view that film censorship reflects the degree of powerlessness of the censor points to the reality that to censor a film, ironically, is to acknowledge the potential that the film medium has to influence the behavior of the audience. In other words, censorship becomes an iron veil to hide the lies, deformities and fantasies of a ruthless, unproductive power, which begets a numbing collective fear of meaningful social conversation or public discourse, of openly questioning the way things are and imagining what they ought to be. Zaliza. 1996:10. In fact, official assumptions have always been that if film is capable of influencing the behavior of people positively, nothing can stop filmmakers from using film to communicate ideas and images that undermine the government or state laws. On the other hand, to put restrictions on film is a way of reminding filmmakers that they have a social obligation of transmitting health ideas and images to the public. This viewpoint is supported by Moto, 2009:129, who defines film censorship as the restriction by which authority, political, religious and media institution, disapproves of any expression or image regarded as dangerous to that authority and to the political and moral order it sustains. The idea of moral order shows that film censorship is ideological. An understanding is that state authority insists on upholding a moral order and the state is inclined to act as it does to justify its existence as a state, and as a way of countering competition from other ideological forces. Taken from this angle, censorship of any kind becomes a system of control in which authority deals with language expressions that are likely to question the application of state power. However, the narrowness of Moto's 2009 definition, like the one provided by Peleg 1993, is that the definition confines censorship to the actions of authority but not to filmmakers and individual characters who might put constrictions on what they say or do through self-censorship. Cohen's conceptualization of film censorship, as the exclusion of some discourses as the result of a judgment by an authoritative agent based on some ideological predisposition, Negash 2003:133, is also similar to one provided by Moto, 2009. Negash, 2003, goes on to say that Cohen's definition puts all the definitions, from Enlightenment to constructivists, on the spectrum of judgment, and then emphasizes judgment on ideological grounds. While Cohen's emphasis of ideology will better inform one's focus on politics, the constructivists fare better in laying out the context and the public/private spheres of film censorship and criticism. A dynamic understanding of the concept of censorship is provided by Janssen's definition that emphasizes that film censorship encompass all socially and economically structured proscriptions and prescriptions which inhibit or prohibit dissemination of ideas, information, images and messages. 2001, 133. Janssen's definition is distinctive from the one provided by Cohen in Negash, 2003, in that it accentuates the social and economic sides of modern film censorship by reinforcing the idea that market forces have replaced the Enlightenment notions of message control. Examining film censorship from the vantage of those who fear the potency of film as well as from the perspective of those who seek emancipation reminds us of the dialectical relationship of censorship and efforts primed to resist censorship. Bailio, 1985, asserts that the classical liberal definition of film censorship has the virtue of clarity but the vice of limitedness. As used, for example, in classical debates over the constitutionality of law restricting free expression, film censorship has come to mean prior restraint of subversive language and images mandated by law and imposed by police, judicial or administrative power, ibid. Bailio, 1985, 9, goes further to say that all other restraints on free expression, from after the fact obscenity to boycotts or protests that exert pressure on film producers to conform consciously or unconsciously to conventions of taste or quality, fall outside the terrain of film censorship. The classic liberal argument insists that, without the legitimacy and force given to filmmakers by state sanctions, the pressure exerted on filmmakers is more or less self-correcting or at least, partly balanced by countervailing forces. These countervailing forces involve the contexts of film production and audience reception of film messages. Using a postmodern interpretation, Bailio, 1985. Just as Dick, 2008, has done, redefines film censorship not as one or more discrete acts of state repressive actions on free expression, but rather as unstable processes involving negotiations, acquiescence or opposition to dominant political, economic, and ideological discourses. Typologies of film censorship in Zimbabwe. There are different types of censorship that a film can be subjected to in Zimbabwe. These forms of censorship can feature in separate ways, or one can influence the occurrence of another at different or similar times, in different or same places. State censorship. Film in Zimbabwe manifests itself as verbal, written and visual art. According to Nell Edel, 2008:15, state censorship is part of the criminal law system, which is an extension of social censorship since rules formulated by the community to determine what may and may not be said freely, may be incorporated into rules enforced by the police, the courts and film institutions. State censorship assumes one of two forms, namely, a priori censorship and punitive censorship. A priori censorship is preventive censorship that was applied to the film Flame, 1996, before its release. The Herald newspaper of January 13, 1996 reported that police in Harare seized negatives of film Flame basing on the argument that it contained subversive information and some of its parts were pornographic. Police said they would seek the assistance of the censorship board, who are expected to view the film and determine whether it contains undesirable scenes or not. Zimedia, 2010, 1. A week after the first report, the Herald newspaper story of January 20, Herald 1996, was to further report that police cleared the makers of the feature film Flame of obscenity allegations and returned rough prints seized last week, saying there was no basis for laying a charge of obscenity. Zimedia, 2010:1. The two examples cited above reflect that a priori censorship endows power to particular people, the police or institution, censorship board, to examine beforehand the contents of what is to be said, depicted and written through a medium of communication. On punitive censorship, Nell Edel, 2008, contends that prior permission for distribution of information need not be sought, but fines, punishment, imprisonment or compensation may be imposed on those responsible for the distribution of information, in whatever form, if it is beyond certain parameters laid down by the law. Punitive censorship is mainly focused on controlling the distribution of material considered as subversive. In Nell Edel's 2008 conceptualization of censorship, the latter is formed by blind repression and encourages a culture of intolerance on the part of the state. Ngugi in Nigash, 2003, provides an expanded and contradictory view of state censorship by presenting 5 strategies that a state usually enacts to contain the potency of film language, and these are: 1. Co-opting the ideas of the film. 2. Banning the film completely. 3. Forcing self-censorship through police terror. 4. Taming film makers as praise singers for the state or ignoring their concerns. 5. Attempting the impossible task of bringing filmmakers into political leadership. If all these fail, maiming their mind and body or expelling them from society through death or exile is also considered a viable censoring option. Nyasha Mbodi, 2012, provided concrete examples of instruments used in state censorship of films in Zimbabwe. Question: do you know Zimbabwean films that have suffered state-imposed restrictions? Answer: it is difficult to cite many Zimbabwean films that were censored officially, because censorship in Zimbabwe happens before even the film is made. There is no censorship in Zimbabwe because censorship is everywhere. One automatically knows what not to include because the topics that get you in trouble are well known. Call it censorship or whatever. I think it's very structural and violent. In 2011, the much publicized case in which University of Zimbabwe law lecturer, Munyaradzi Gwizai, and several others were charged with treason for showing videos encouraging North Africa-style uprisings comes to mind. Clearly, videos can lead to charges of treason in present-day Zimbabwe. At the end of the year 2011, the Media Monitoring Project of Zimbabwe's offices were raided and videos, hard drives and other material confiscated by the police on suspicion of being subversive or containing subversive messages. Rayburn's Flame is one case in point when the film was briefly banned and some material ordered cut for apparent nudity/pornography, when in fact the rape scene in question seemed to have rubbed the state the wrong way, since rape was not an uncommon occurrence during the Liberation War, leading to war veterans lambasting/demonstrating against the film. I can't remember from where, but it must have been the Newsday paper that a government minister, it must have been Sthembiso Nyoni, walked out of the premiere of the 2010 film Lobola, objecting against its perceived cultural blasphemies. The film was briefly delayed from showing in the cinemas. This point needs to be checked against the actual facts, while its suitability was being vetted. There is also, of course, the common practice of donor funders limiting Zimbabwean films to donor themes. Anyhow, many if not most Zimbabwean productions resort to innuendo and metaphor to poke fun at or to critically discuss the government and other taboo topics. A case in point are the recent proliferations of Zim movies being made Nigerian movie-style, cheap, DVD format, unprofessional, street-marketed, but popular while managing to bypass the censor. This, I believe, is the dawn of the real Zimbabwean film. These movies have slowly begun to recover, via filmic means, the space that official censorship had made its own. Questionnaire interview Nyasha Mbodi, January 29, 2012, 1646. From Mbodi, 2012, state-induced censorship on film is structural everywhere. Involves banning of some material, and is also practiced by donor funders. At the same time, counter-censorship strategies by filmmakers involve the use of innuendo and metaphor to poke fun on taboo topics. In support of Mbodi, 2012, Deworst, 2002, views state censorship as a form of control that involves bans, forfeitures, destruction of subversive material, investigations, interrogations, trials in courts, criminal punishments and incarcerations. In Zimbabwe, state censorship can even Involve Central Intelligence Organization, CIO, members who are likely to torture and intimidate a filmmaker who produces a film deemed to be sensitive. Ngugi aptly captures the contradictory nature of state-induced censorship when he expounded that to let an artist go into global space means attracting the attention of the world. Besides, the word of exile may very well travel back to the territory to go on haunting the state. The state would still like to overcome the contradictions of prison, exile and physical elimination by doing all it can so that the artist could end up being a homeless wanderer in search of space. Negash, 2003:134. In Zimbabwe, the state is not always directly imposing censorship through invoking POSA or AIPPA. Secret law enforcing agents are empowered to control and monitor the production and dissemination of information. Dewhurst, 2002. This result in another insidious form of state censorship carried out at the administrative level. Administrative state censorship. Administrative state censorship involves methods of control by institutions set up by the government. Administrative state censorship manifests itself through a government-appointed body that directly and immediately ban material or sometimes classify material. Nell Edel, 2008. The now-defunct Media Information Commission, MIC, was one such example of repressive administrative state censorship. Once headed by Tafatana Mahoso as its chairperson, MIC was responsible for the laying out and application of ground rules of how media in Zimbabwe conduct business. Mahoso had the power to contest in the courts of law against any material printed or visual that he deemed unfit for the interests of the government. Government objectives were also supported through a 75% local content policy adopted by the Zimbabwe Broadcasting Cooperation, ZBC. Although the local content policy helped to promote upcoming artists, it isolated Zimbabweans from receiving alternative broadcasting from other countries. The 75% local content policy excluded and restricted foreign film productions that were likely to broaden people's understanding of social realities. In this manner, the 75% policy on local content became a form of administrative state censorship that was meant to control an influx of foreign films likely to unsettle the ruling government's monopoly on information production and dissemination. Unlike the administrative state censorship advocated by the state, institutional censorship in the film industry is applied by the personnel working in the administration of film production. Institutional censorship. Censorship resulting from the production and editorial policies in the film industry exemplifies institutional censorship. According to Dewhurst, 2002, excluding ideas not conforming to the editorial policy of the film industry is a form of censorship. Conversely, including ideas that conform to the editorial policy is also another form of censorship. This contradictory position, as Donald and Renov, 2008, point out, is brought about by the reality that the borderline between editing and censoring in film production is always difficult to establish. By implication, the two authors are assuming that the material that is left out during editing could otherwise be the one that fully addresses the concerns of the audience. Interestingly, Dewhurst, 2002, argues that film scriptwriters, producers, directors and editors have never agreed on ways of perceiving social reality. This implies that whatever ideas included in the final product have censored other ideas that threaten the status quo or ideas that cannot conform to the editorial policies of the film institution. Audiences, operating at the receiving end, may not have the platform to contest the validity of the ideas or information included in the film narrative. The style and content of a film's story become a form of censorship by virtue of the editorial power to close alternative ways of telling the same story. In Zimbabwe, most films dealing with cultural issues, such as gender, are implicated in painting a negative picture of the roles women play in society and culture through stereotyping. This happens at the point of meaning. Inscription, Kuhn, 1988, where cultural stereotypes are embedded within film images. Stereotyping is a form of institutional censorship for its capacity to restrict possibilities of imagining change or a newness regarding the roles women play in the Zimbabwean society. Economic censorship. The ability of film industry to function properly is determined by the availability of funds. Lack of proper funding means that film projects take a longer time to materialize, or are dropped out completely. The result, as Dewhurst, 2002, observes, is that information or ideas can fail to reach the audience. The situation regarding lack of funding is described as economic censorship. Economic censorship in Zimbabwe usually arises from a situation in which the state, non-governmental organizations, or independent filmmakers decline to fund a film project that does not support their aims and objectives. When the state funds film production, the likelihood of patronage is high. Chiwome describes patronage as a form of censorship, 1996. 30. Patronage as censorship. Donors are prepared to sponsor films with ideas that conform to their interests. The control by donors of film scripting and production of film is a form of censorship that can restrict the creativity of script writers, producers, and directors. Drag, 1993. Supports Chiwome, 1996, in viewing patronage as censorship in that sponsors can divert the audience from focusing on pertinent issues by proposing less savory themes. Emerging as it were from economic censorship, patronage can make film makers to promote foreign values that do not suggest solutions to the challenges being faced by local people. Patronage is thus a weapon of propaganda that can be used by sponsors to promote self-serving interests. Chiwome, 1996. Internalized or self-censorship. Self-censorship entails suppressing information that one feels can jeopardize his/her life under specific conditions. Commenting on the sensitivity of the rape scene in the film Flame, Lion, 1997, writes that, among the female ex-combatants, the topic of rape is still a sensitive issue, and women in particular are not enthusiastic to discuss it. Many ex-combatants do not readily talk about the war at all. Often based on their own experience, they fear that by talking about forced sexual encounters they will be labeled prostitutes. The fear in ex-combatants as well as the fear in characters of Flame to expose atrocities other than the rape case is a reflection of the psychological state of self-censorship. Chiwome, 1996, asserts that a suppressed psychological state of mind is self-censorship that emerges from lack of confidence in deciding what must be included in film and what ought to be excluded. Suppressing deep feelings and convictions arise out of fear of being victimized. Self-censorship. 4. Filmmakers in Zimbabwe sometimes appear as a self-conscious act of removing scenes and language expressions from film that are likely to draw unfavorable comments from the audiences. Self-censorship is a result of fear of being persecuted or rebuked. It is a deeply internalized culture of submission. Zazila, 1996. Fear inhibits the creativity of filmmakers and their ability to speak out freely about human abuses perpetrated by the state or by those powerful members in the Zimbabwean society. Ben Mahaka, a Zimbabwean filmmaker, provides a repertoire of censorship styles and attitudes that have been imposed on filmmakers in Zimbabwe. Question: what types of restrictions can a filmmaker be subjected to? Answer: movement, access to equipment, access to events and locations, licenses and permits. Questionnaire interview with Ben Mahaka, April 12, 2012, 1540. The state can invoke subtle forms of censorship besides relying on force, banning of films, intimidation and incarceration of non-conforming filmmakers. POSA has been used to deny filmmakers the chance to shoot films on specific locations or have access to state information that could help filmmakers to develop their story lines. The Zimbabwean government has declined to issue licenses and permits to retail outlets that sell films. In the same interview, Mahaka further provides concrete evidence of his personal encounter with censorship imposed by local authorities working under the auspices of government. Question: if any, how do you describe your personal experiences with state-imposed control? Answer: denied access to Mbeere Farmers Market for a documentary film on conservation agriculture by the Harare City Council. I was denied permission to shoot a documentary film on women's rights in Makoni District. Questionnaire interview with Ben Mahaka, April 12, 2012, 1540. If censorship of filmmakers does not directly come from the Censorship Board, which is the major arm that controls entertainment in Zimbabwe, it can emerge from local authorities who work in consultation with the Censorship Board. Local authorities can use their discretionary powers to prohibit the shooting of a movie that is likely to challenge government policies or bring into disrepute the morality of people in the community from within which the shooting is taking place. Political censorship. Political censorship in Zimbabwe reflects what Mbembe, 2001, calls the banality of power, in which laws are unashamedly passed in order to openly undermine creativity. The Censorship and Entertainment Controls Act, Chapter 10, 04, Part 111, states that the Censorship Board shall not approve any film or film advertisement which, in its opinion, depicts any matter that is indecent or obscene or is offensive or harmful to public morals, or is likely to be contrary to the interests of defense, public safety, public order, the economic interests of the state or public health. In the Censorship and Entertainment Controls Act, Chapter 10, 04, words such as obscene, subversive, indecent, offensive are embedded and entrenched as the vocabulary of legal statutes designed to prevent artists from writing material or creating film images considered offensive by the state. The Public Order and Security Act, POSA, gazetted in 2002, POSA, prevents political insurgency, banditry, sabotage, and terrorism, Kubatana.net, 2003. POSA also prohibits publishing or communicating false statements prejudicial to the state, 2003, 1. The Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, Chapter 10, 27, enacted and passed into law by the new black government in 2003, controls the right to information, access to information, abuse of freedom of expression, protection of information whose disclosure will be harmful to law enforcement, process and national security, information otherwise available to the public, Kubatana. Net, 2003:1 and 2. The legal language in the laws that promote political censorship of ideas is crafted in ways calculated to confuse artists as what exactly is expected of them. Legal ambiguity. Thus attempts to intimidate artists from experimenting with film language because artists do not know whether or not their artistic language falls within the range of what the state deems subversive. Theoretical framework. No single theory can adequately explain the complexities of the relationship between language, film, and censorship. Therefore, this study is based on eclectic media theories that explain the ambiguities and ambivalence in the language of film, meanings that make films a site of ideological contestation. Theories on media law and film censorship. Film theories must be able to provide answers to the questions such as, what are human values? What is morality? What is harm? How can film censorship safeguard human dignity? Human values are defined as criteria for selecting the right conduct or action, what Plaisance describes as the capacity by human beings to manifest and exercise judgment, preference, and choice, 2009, 21. Choice suggests that audiences have rights to express freely, independent thought and constantly search for suitable values that sustain and not stymie life. Harendranath, 2009, contends that in appreciating film texts we must exercise the critical right to view images as neither completely polysemic to the point of encouraging semantic nihilism, nor capable of presenting its narratives as unified structures. This is because, as McCoy, 1993, points out, while the object of the laws on film censorship is to cultivate the right values in people, the truth about the shifting nature of values can be obscured by those with vested interests and power to conceal reality. Theories must enable 1. To question the morality informing censorship laws. Litch, 2002, 120, states that there are no objective facts, the truth of all moral evaluations is relative either to an individual or cultural moral standard. The view that moral objectivism concerning what is right or wrong depends on what the rules and laws of the state stipulate, and not on individual values or not on what any group of people think about legislated laws. This notion must be interrogated. In other words, the view must be questioned and clearly explicated because it is based on the dominant power's understanding of what harm done by images is and is not. Bandura, 1960, argues that if children are exposed to violent images and pornographic material, they can be negatively affected and harmed as they are bound to imitate and vicariously participate in promoting undesirable behavior in society and culture. However, what is harmful to state interests can in fact provide the conditions of possibility of freedom for the majority of people. Thus, the legal and philosophical basis for film censorship is shaky. It is not truthful for all, and at all times. In Zimbabwe, Section 13 of the Censorship and Entertainment Controls Act, Chapter 1004, says that it is an offense to print, publish, produce, distribute or sell an undesirable publication. From this understanding, a publication or production is considered undesirable if it is indecent, obscene, offensive and harmful to public morals, Felto, 2003. Listed on harmful and undesirable publications are those are deemed as compromising the interests of defense, public safety, public order, the economic interests of the state or health. Mazango and Chiumbu, 2000, have identified 4 elements of indecency or obscenity substantiated in Section 27 of Censorship and Entertainment Control Act. According to the 2 authors, film material is deemed indecent or obscene if 1. It has the indecency to deprave or corrupt the minds of persons who are likely to be exposed to the effect or influence thereof, or it is in any way subversive of moral values. 2. Whether or not related to any sexual content, the material is considered unsuitable if it unduly exploits horror, cruelty and violence. 3. Offensive to public morals and likely to be outrageous or disgusting to persons who are likely to read, hear or see it. 4. Harmful to public morals and deals in an improper or offensive manner with criminal or immoral behavior. Words such as obscenity, indecency, offensive, morality and national interests are tentative. Nicol 1984. There is no agreement on the proper limits of what the words designate both in the censorship laws and in terms of their practical application. However, the differential traces and slippages in the meaning of film language and images produce countercultures that can question the ideological basis of using words that enforce a dominant worldview. Deleuze argues that censorship laws are born out of fear and mistrust of other potentially competitive discourses. For Ndlila, 2003, freedom of expression is an important aspect of democratic processes because it promotes all other human rights. Lichtenberg, 1990. Berendt, 1993. The degree of press freedom in any country is seen as a barometer by which to measure the democratic quality of government and its commitment to rights and liberties of its citizens. Suppression of film ideas through the imposition of draconian censorship laws underlines the lack and fear of freedom. Censorship laws provide for ruling classes the ideological frames with which to limit, prevent, and prohibit creative thought among artists. The reasons for imposing censorship laws on art are explained in terms of class struggle in Marxist theories that emphasize the production/prohibition model. Marxist theories and the production/prohibition model. Censoring the language of film is usually defended by governments as an important exercise done for the preservation of moral order upon which each and every citizen depends for his, her safety and well-being. White, 1997, argues that controlling film images protects the ideology of the ruling class, the rich and the powerful people. Protecting the prevailing ideology is considered vital because ideology serves to legitimize the ruling class and the various social, political, and economic arrangements they oversee. Thus, film censorship operates on the assumption that the thoughts, feelings, opinions, beliefs, and fantasies of human beings ought to be a subject of moral judgment, and ultimately, social and government responsibility. 1997, 56. Dick, 2008, disagrees and asserts that film censorship reveals the condition of powerlessness on the part of the censor whose action is usually motivated by fear. The purpose of laws that control film language is to categorize types of verbal and visual expressions as illicit primarily as a way of marking out distinct classes of people within society. The foregoing theoretical assumptions are foregrounded by the Marxist theory and the production prohibition model. Although the Marxist explanation brings out the power of ideology on film, the perspective undermines the existential powers of individuals to resist official discourses of censorship. The artists can do this by using film language in ways that create various escape corridors. These escape corridors involve the use of new media technologies such as computerized film images and cell phones with Bluetooth facility that can enhance the exchanging of film images considered obscene or subversive by the state. The above view contradicts the belief upheld in the critical theory advanced by Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, for whom the culture industry such as film was totally infiltrated by dominant values, resulting in no film space to contest the values of the ruling classes. In Marxist language, framing is usually used to refer to the way news reporters shape the content and context of news items by putting emphasis on what should be thought about and the range of acceptable debate on a particular topic/event. Framing also depicts the power of filmmakers to decide what issues should be thought about and debated in film. Entman and Fortunato, 2005, 51, asserts that to frame is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation for the item described. This study views the film audience as a heterogeneous group that can reorganize and give coherence to the components that constitute a film frame, and direct attention to particular aspects of the frame to reveal meanings that are not always anticipated by dominant narratives. Thus, while some theoretical aspects of the production/prohibition model in the Marxist theory cannot be ignored, my own study argues that audience reframing of film meanings is a process that implies that audiences can subvert or negotiate meaning from a film narrative. Audience framing also implies recognizing the capability of film directors to select and confine film images so that the images appeal to a particular audience formed by cultural issues of class, age, group, gender, and race. To complicate my own deployment of the concept of reframing film's meanings, audience framing can manifest itself as an unconscious process in which audiences manifest a narrow understanding of social reality. The production/prohibition theory perceives stereotyping as one way in which dominant frames are constructed by a film narrative to undermine possibilities for change in life for the film's characters. A stereotype is an arrested frame of reference because it misrepresents the symbolical identities of human beings to their lived experience. Wolf, 1992:706, argues that a stereotype is constructed on the basis of excess and inhibition. By excessive depiction, Wolf, 1992, understands that a stereotype is described or named using singular values that censor other possible interpretations. Since a stereotype is built on fixed frames of reference that emphasize singularity of values, then a stereotype is mystical. It claims for itself unitary values based on racial, ethnic, gender, class and generational absolutism, and in this way inhibits critical thought. For Babha, 1996, a stereotype is sutured and as such it is prevented from realizing its full desire, that is to censor meanings. In film narratives, cultural stereotypes simultaneously recognize and disavow racial/cultural/historical differences. Ibid, 1996, 40. Stereotype recognizes differences by investing certain meanings, and not others, in film images. For Babha, 1996, 40, excess of signification on one hand, and rejection of difference on the other, make stereotype a site of dreams, fantasies, myths and obsessions operating in a tight system informed by the false impression of cultural stability. My study argues that in attempting to project one meaning and suppressing other potential meanings and characters, stereotypes in film narratives ironically invites the critic to search for alternative meanings outside the figure that is stereotyped. Interpretations of realities off the screen provide alternative routes to escape censorship embedded in cultural stereotypes contained in film narratives. Psychological theories also expand knowledge on how film censorship manifests and is contested. The psychological explanation. Psychological views on the sensorial dispositions on film suggest that behavior may be explained as a projection of repressions tightly imposed upon a character. The repressions entail controlling powerful, but deeply recessed drives toward sexual expression or aggression. By censoring behavior, according to Bailio, 1985, a film character reaffirms self-control and increases the gap between the conscious self and disturbing impulses or temptations within. While Bailio, 1985, attributes psychological views of film censorship to character behavior, an expanded perspective that explains how a government can control film, and by extension, people's attitudes is expressed. By Lamb, 2008, 488, who asserts that understanding the structural properties of attitudes is key to assessing potential susceptibility to persuasive attempts by film makers, and predicting the extent to which related behaviors will be cultivated in the audiences. Lamb, 2008, 488, goes on to highlight 4 government responses to situations where a film's free expression conflicts with attitudes and behaviors stipulated by laws of the state. The responses entail: 1. Stopping the expression from happening, prior restraint. 2. Punishing the source of expression after the expression has occurred. Subsequent punishment. 3. Defining when, where or how the expression can happen, time, space and manner restrictions. 4. Doing nothing to stop the expression from happening, allow. Unfortunately, the psychological explanation that drives officials to impose censorship laws inadvertently project dominant narratives as always winning in the ideological war to make meanings out of film viewing. The sociological approach provides the material drives for the existence of censorship laws in society. The sociological explanation. The quest to censor film language involves the desire to have the censor's own values, morals, cultural standards or those of the group or class to which the censor belongs reflected through film. In Zimbabwe, the status of the ruling class is enhanced or diminished by the degree to which the morals, ethical or aesthetic standards of the ruling class are enforced through film images. Bailio, 1985, 515. From this sociological perspective, the motives for censoring films are multifold. The motives include prevention of film pornography, violent and erotic depictions, as well as inhibitions placed on representing certain social, political, economic, religious, and aesthetic values. Unfortunately, the sociological explanation of why censorship happens does not expand to include an analysis of why the audiences of films emerge with their own meanings out of watching the movies. This perspective is explained in audience reception theories analyzed below. Film censorship and audience reception approaches. Marxist theories are reductive. They underestimate the capacity of film audiences to implant their own meanings in the images they are viewing in film. Stuart Hall, 1980. Viewed texts as possessing encoded meanings which would then be decoded by the audience. Hall, 1980, reads media texts as susceptible to diverse interpretations based on politico-ideological contradictions. According to Stamm, 2000, Hall proposed 3 broad reading strategies treated as the 1. Dominant reading produced by a viewer situated to acquiesce in dominant ideology and the subjectivity it produces. 2. A negotiated reading produced by the viewer who largely acquiesces in dominant ideology. Real-life situation provokes specific local critical reflection. 3. Resistant or oppositional reading produced by those whose social situation and consciousness place them in direct oppositional relation to dominant ideology. 2000, 230. Hall's conceptualization of audience reception of media messages has got some relevance to the concept of film censorship. For instance, his proposition that the dominant ideology possessed the power to define social realities underlies the idea that state censorship has got the power to define or even sanction the kind of attitude and behavior to be expected through film images. Yet, Hall states that audiences can create spaces of dialogue during the viewing process, so that values which define film censorship can be negotiated. By oppositional reading, Hall implies that the audiences do not simply acquiesce to the meanings in dominant discourses in film. The audience can totally disagree with the kind of values that are imposed on film. Images by the Board of Censors. Morley, 1980, modified Hall's romanticized audience responses to experiencing film when he suggests that some media messages remain structured in dominance. The structured polysemy promoted by film censors provides a range of interpretations from audiences that can be trapped in a discourse that appears to be a force of liberation, but in actual fact infiltrated subtly by dominant values. However, a theoretical shift in focus from structured polysemy attracted polymorphous traditions of message reception whose main emphasis considered the contexts, primarily the microsettings of reception. These microsettings aligned film to diverse taste publics whose ability to use new media technology placed audiences on a much stronger ground against state censorship of film images. 4. Example, these microsettings enabled individuals to access and disseminate material considered undesirable through DVDs, DSTV with multiple and exclusive channel repertoire, cell phones with Bluetooth, Internet and YouTube facilities. In my study, I argue, particularly in Chapter 5, that experimentation with form, technique and style in films can undermine forms of official censorship of films. The audience's theories place emphasis on people's ability to manipulate language to generate meanings that had not been intended to be secured by censors and even the film makers. My study is steeped in the language-based theories that encourage broadening interpretations of the contradictory play of censorship and the desire to be freed from this subordination and submersion into the values of the ruling classes. Language theories and the politics of interpretation. Conceptualizing the language/discourse of film censorship starts with recognizing the symbolic instability of semiotic signs. Barth's, 1967, shows that language is made up of signs such as words that communicate meanings. People's perception of the world and understanding of social reality is constructed through words and expressions which they use. Bignell, 2002. Once a sign is produced, it begins a life of its own independent from the person who generated it, continues using it or interprets it. The implication to the discourse of film censorship is that once state laws construct words and expressions to define the kind of values expected from film images, the polysemic nature of film language allows state laws to be read in many ways. In other words, a sign and its semiotic materiality is what lies beyond the sphere of the subject, whether the censor or the censored. Ponzio, 1993, notes that the sign's constitutive plurivocality is determined by identities of otherness. Otherness implies difference, which is the ability of a sign to mutate to new forms of meanings, themselves having the capacity to resist ideological containment. The Saussurian assumption that a constructed sign starts an important life of its own underlies the arbitrary nature of signs. Yet, the same idea of signs having a life of their own can rob signs of human agency in directing signs to meaningful social, political and economic activities. Post-Saussurian traditions have preoccupied themselves on establishing how signs can be combined together to form discourses of the powerful and weak in society and culture. Foucault is a post-Saussurian theorist who explained how hegemony and power can be sustained through discourse. The idea that power is productive as well as coercive, situational as well as pervasive, adds a crucial dimension to Foucault's contribution. McCoy, 1993. The Foucaultian dimension also explains why state censorship of film images should not be viewed as totally a disadvantage. Power authorized through discourse does not work only as a form of repression, but it also displays its productive side. For example, the language of state laws that sanctions film from producing pornographic material or extreme violent images is done for the moral health of communities. Yet, power's reproduction of social discipline by acculturating film viewers to intended norms and values is a sure way in which the hegemonic tendency of power is displayed. The dilemma, as noted by McCoy, 1993, 147, is how to discuss power while remaining faithful to power's relational tendencies to emerge, displace, educate, abuse, appropriate, and control without making of it either a formula or transcendental scheme. The functional nature of power is further expanded in the Foucauldian idea of capillary form of existence, Milner 1991, 74, which is a point where power reaches into the very existence of individuals, touches their bodies and inserts itself into people's actions and attitudes, their discourses, learning processes and everyday activities. Although strong in its visioning of power's functional role, the Foucauldian capillary form of existence, 1991, 74, underestimates human agency encouraged by intentional actions and reactions. The intentional actions and reactions can explain why some audience choose to oppose censored material by viewing it as an example of how freedom of expression is muffled by the state or institutional board of censors. The discursive subject of censorship is not entirely the construct of culturally determining forces via discursive institutions and systems of knowledge. The implication of viewing the audience as entirely affected by official discourses place limitations, as the view assumes that audiences cannot think outside the box or go against the grain. For Derrida, discourses are incomplete linguistic systems that are produced by the play of difference, Howarth, 2002, 42, and which mediate and organize our experience of the world. By the word incomplete, Derrida implies that there are gaps and points of undecidability, 2002, 42, in the cultural texts which enable official discourses to both cohere and organize themselves, but at the same time, serve to undermine their coherence and unity. Put in another way, although official discourses of film censorship are organized in such a way as to focus on intended behavioral exposition, the weaknesses of such discourses can inherently be explained by the instability in the language of reference. In film, linguistic instability breeds polysemy. In language, which means characters' words, sound and music, color, characters, actions and costume can be subjected to multiple readings. Thus, by its very nature, film text is a reconstruction. In this recreated text, the film writes its text, modifies, and combines its codes, playing some codes off against others, and thus constituting itself as a semiotic system. The system is a product of de/construction, which is a form of textual exegesis, the un/packing of film texts, a way of questioning unspoken discourses while being aware to the text's discursive heterogeneity. The concept of text, etymologically, tissue or weave, Stam, 2000:186, conceptualizes film not only as a mimesis, but also as a re/construction of reality. This view is important to my study that explores how film narratives refuse to be totally subdued by dominant narratives that take the forms of state and even modes of self-censorship. The Bakhtinian concept of heteroglossia, 1981, complicates Derrida's play of differences concept. Heteroglossia is based on the notion of competing language and discourses as they operate within both text and context. When applied to my study, This entails the presence of the interlocking language of the film censor and the censored. As Bakhtin points out, the language, of heteroglossia may be placed side by side, mutually supplement one another, in intertext or even contradict one another. 1981, theories of intertextuality view every text as related to other texts. 4. Example, a television text can operate within the broader context of a film text, or a newspaper story can create important leads to the main story of a film text. The dialogue that obtains refer to the open-ended possibilities generated by all the discursive practices of film culture, the entire matrix of communicative utterances within which the film text is situated. Stam, 2000. Bakhtin, 1981, goes further to suggest the idea of a chronotope. The chronotope in film mediates between two orders of experience and discourse, the historical and the artistic. These two aspects provide fictional environments where constellations of power are dramatized. The Bakhtinian chronotope goes deeper to reveal how concrete spatiotemporal structures in film shots amplify meaning, shape characterization and mold the discursive space between the language of the film censor and the censored. Within the spatiotemporal structures of a film shot, language is split, conflict-ridden, dispersed and drastically heterogeneous even as it is systematic, highly coded, patterned and regular. Palmer, 1989, 313. The postmodern chronotopic. Multiplicities on the film screen facilitated by computer, video technology, high definitive camera and three-dimensional configurations further amplify possibilities for fracture, rupture, and cultural polyphony. In short, it can be a difficult task to impose hard and fast laws of censorship on film images, conflict-ridden as it is by the imaginative dynamics brought by new film technology, the underlying discourses of the state, ideas of filmmakers, audiences, horizons of expectations, polysemous nature of film language, verbal and nonverbal, and the context of film production. My study makes use of Bakhtinian, 1981, ideas of how film language can carnivalize, undercut, and subvert monological dominant discourses. This will help me to account why some films pay obeisance to the structures of feeling infiltrated by dominant and censoring perspectives, while other films accept the principle of linguistic heteroglossia that encourages dialogism within narratives of films aspiring to germinate and inseminate new values in the society. The liminality of visual languages in film. Foueri and Foueri, 2003, theorized liminality and fluidity of visual images in films evoked by bodies of performing actors. The critics emphasize the importance of visuals such as color, props and mise-en-scene that can have the potential to elide state censorship as well as challenge the ideological containment induced by film makers. The two renowned critics proffer an in-depth analysis on how the bodies of film actors can create ambivalence and ambiguities through subtle movements, gestures, facial expression and complex speech acts that can indirectly attack the status quo. To put it in the words of Foueri and Foueri, 2003, 55. Film characters exploit the shifting nature of verbal and nonverbal cues created by their bodies to disrupt, challenge and revolt against the dominant regimes of interpreting social reality. What this implies is that the body of a film actor has the capacity to question the unseen, the naturalized, and the buried aspects of culture. When film actors perform stories of the oppressed or the censored, their physical and psychological action reflect the internal contradictions of the dominant and subservient cultures. In other words, the body of a film actor is a language of viable physicality and it has The potential to generate images that contest the body's ideological standing, reflecting attitudes of both the censor and the censored. The image of objects and people in film and theater, painting or on television is seen not for what it is, but for what it is to the interpreting subjects/audiences. Investing power into the body as a visual image implies designating specific spectating positions from which the body can be read as a liberating force or a regime of regimenting preferred social and political meanings. Foucault in Fouery and Fouery. 2003, power relations operate as bodily expressions of un/official truths that are part of the construction of the visual image. In the power struggle for dominance, the subjects of censorship can resist and oppose homogeneous social, economic and political positions that seek to unify and totalize all individuals into governed position. Using the term governed, in this context means to be an object of a field of perception or action designed by the wielders of power. Hall, 1980, provides a solid theoretical platform when he asserts that, to resist forms of restrictions from filmmakers, legitimation of power, and state power's essentialisms, the audiences can imagine the bodies of film actors on their own terms to confirm, negotiate or oppose the seduction of visual images. To put it differently, power relations can be played out on the threshold of the spectator's gaze and the gaze of the body as a speaking subject. During a performance, each time the body of a film actor is looked at as an image, it re-asks back, "Who am I?" in the matrix of power politics. In asking this kind of question from the position of the censor and censored, the body of a film actor is determining the position from which it is to be viewed. What this implies is that the body of an actor, whether in its abject condition or as an image reflecting the spectacular in life, has the power to lure the audience towards a specific purpose. These nuanced understanding of how the bodies of the censored or the prohibited can find alternative ways of rediscovering their voices, provide the social, economic, and political dynamics in visual cultures as theorized by Fouery and Fouery, 2003. This analysis of the power of visuals in both reinforcing dominant censoring narratives and in many cases suggesting alternative and liberating values will be explored in this study. The idea is to aim to define the semiotics of film language in a holistic manner that emphasizes the constitutive languages of the verbal, visual, color, sound, and background as implicated in either supporting the status quo or fighting against values embedded in censoring narratives. Methodology. This study uses the qualitative research method to the study of the language of film censorship and the censorship of film language. For Bradley, 1992, applying qualitative methods to the study of phenomenon, film censorship, should be guided by the need to reveal and explain variations in the phenomenon that is normally assumed to have single values. The idea is to critique using different interpretations restrictions imposed on film language by the censors. Rubin and Rubin assert that explanatory potential of qualitative methods are that they can suggest and bring in new dimensions and nuances to the original problem that any one individual might not have thought of. 1995, 140. Qualitative method make use of the technique of open coding understood by Babi and Mouton, 2001, 499, to mean the conscious search for information pertaining to films that are being analyzed. Unlike positivist assumptions promoted by quantitative approaches, the qualitative paradigm analyses the subtle aspects of film censorship that film critics know how to describe with words and expressions. Furthermore, there can be no single, accurate description that film critics agree upon regarding the realities of film censorship in Zimbabwe. For example, abstractions promoted by film censors such as moral values, attitudes, and various human behaviors cannot be objectively measured but remain convenient categories invented by society and culture. Textual analysis. As a qualitative method, textual analysis aims to study the meanings of words and expressions. Textual analysis is a suitable methodology to analyze film language, with a view of establishing the extent to which language is used by state laws and filmmakers to censor alternative ways of perceiving social reality. My assumption is that textual analysis enables this research to place value judgment to the language of filmmakers, language of state censors, and the likely audience responses. This study uses a qualitative or textual approach in its exploration of the language of censorship in selected Zimbabwe films in Shona and English. Qualitative approach has been chosen over quantitative approach because it is first hinged on the belief that there is no one objective reality which can be observed and neutrally quantified. Lemon in Du Ploy, 2001, 33. In other words, qualitative approach is a descriptive research tradition for things that cannot be instrumentally measured, such as feelings, behavior, speech, thoughts, and culture. Secondly, researchers using qualitative approach do not believe that human beings are homogeneous and they can be simply categorized. Thus, the researcher chose this approach in order to explore the heterogeneous nature of human beings in interpreting film texts. In a nutshell, the study takes an interpretive approach to the study of the language of censorship. Interpretive social sciences aim to understand how people in everyday natural settings create meaning and interpret the events of their world. A limited questionnaire will be used to elicit views on censorship from critics of the Zimbabwean film. There is no contradiction in using a limited number of interviews in a qualitative research for as long as it is clarified that the research methodology is qualitative and interpretive in nature. In fact, interviews only serve to support certain views points or complicate them. Therefore, there is a relationship of complementarity rather than replacement between qualitative approach and the limited questionnaire administered to film critics. The study makes extensive use of secondary sources to help explain and argue the case of the manifestation of censorship in films. Secondary sources also provide a perspective from which it is possible to analyze how the same films encode rhetorical devices that directors of film use to challenge different forms of censorship inside and outside the films.